All right. Looks like we are all set to go here. Let me just expand this out a little bit. There we go. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to our first event of the semester. We're very delighted to have Garett Jones with us, one of our foremost macroeconomic experts here at Mason, even though that is a rare thing. We're very glad to have him. You may have crossed paths with him if you've taken intermediate macro or public choice. In addition to being an economics professor here at Mason, he is also the author of Hive Mind, How Your Nation's IQ Matters So Much More Than Your Own. And I happen to have a copy of that here with me as well. So there you go. And he also is the author of 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust Elites a Little More and the Masses a Little Less. In addition to his book writing, and as a professor, he was also the economic policy advisor to Senator Orrin Hatch. And needless to say, he has published in numerous academic journals. So with that, I'll throw it over to you, Dr. Jones. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm very glad to discuss this question. I'm assuming my slide you're displaying at the moment. This question of why should economists engage in mathematical economics? All right, is the screen actually sharing? Can you confirm that for me?
Are you able to move the mic a little closer? It sounds just, oh, there you go. There you go.
Is the mic a little worse?
Perfect. That sounds good.
Okay, it's great. Yeah, is the screen available? Is the screen visible? Just so I know.
Yeah, it's visible.
Trying to share. Great. Yeah, a great question, and for anybody studying complex societies, is why would you want to use mathematical methods to study this? So consider one classic area where people use mathematical methods try to study an important, complicated question about entire societies. So let's think about the quantity theory of money. I think of this as one of the most influential mathematical models that are an attempt to explain an entire set of social phenomenon with one simple equation. Most of you, I'm going to take it for granted that almost everyone here has had some experience with the quantity theory of money, the idea that money growth causes inflation. Now, this is an obviously totally reductionistic model, ridiculous oversimplification of an entire complex reality, trying to boil down the entire world to one simple equation. And as I'm assuming just about everybody here knows, the quantity theory predicts that in the long run, a 1% rise in money causes a 1% rise in prices. How am I doing on audio right now, James?
Sounds great.
Great. So this isn't just a claim about correlation, right? This is a claim about causation. Right? This is a claim that if governments take policies that grow the money supply by 10%, that by itself causes prices to rise by 10%. Right? So this is beyond just correlation and patterns and claims about statistics. This is a story about cause and effect, totally quantifiable. So like a lot of equations, like a lot of theoretical models, it starts with a topology and then builds in some assumptions. So as most of you know, the way the equation goes, the way the quantity theory starts off, it's the idea that spending equals income, that money, some measure of money times the speed at which it's spent, money times velocity, equals prices of output plus real output. So times real output, excuse me, I'm given logs already. So as you know, it often goes by MV equals PY. So what happens when how do you take something, how can you sum up an entire economy in such a simple way? How could this possibly ever work? Aren't people too complicated to be understood? Aren't human interactions created by a spontaneous order that can't be easily mathematized? Well, let's see. So quantity theorists, of course, are making these absurd false assumptions. They assume that velocity and real output aren't affected at all by money or by prices. I mean, I thought the heart of economics is that prices affect people's choices. And wouldn't the amount of money have something to do with how much people spend? Well, again, remember, this is a quantity theorists always emphasize that their stories about the long run. They don't try to make it often a theory of the short run, though real business cycle theory people do. But by the time they make these absurd false assumptions that there's a fixed velocity of money and a fixed amount of real output, that's exogenous to how much money people have and what the price level is, they've gone a long way toward just adding in one more ridiculous false assumption after another. These mathematical economists, what are they up to? So they keep mathematizing it further. Quantity theorists don't just stop at one assumption. They take logs of things. They use logarithms or percentage growth rates, depending on how you want to look at it. And they simplify, and then they get this result. The change in prices per year in the long run will equal the change in money per year in percentage terms again, plus some other garbage terms. As I say here, right? Clearly, this has got to be an example of a pretense of knowledge. How can you take an entire national economy, simplify it so much, and hope to make any real world claims about what people are like? So, and then these folks, they get in a hole and they just keep digging. They predict an absolutely precise mathematical relationship between money and prices. If this isn't false pretense of knowledge, what is? So, as you know, the equation ends up looking like this. Annual price growth equals 1 times the percent annual money growth. 1.0. Like, they're not just saying, hey, you put some money in, prices go up, we don't know how much. They say exactly 1% more money growth causes exactly 1% more higher prices. So this is an obviously flawed model that makes obviously false assumptions, that tries to simplify the complex spontaneous orders created by real complicated people who have subjective knowledge of their situations. And then macroeconomists have the pride, the hubris, to try to confront this obviously flawed model with real world data. And they've done it again and again over the decades. So let's test this out the way people have for a long time. We're taking World Bank data. I just grabbed this stuff this morning off of the World Bank's, I think it's called the Data Bank website, World Development Indicators, WDI, for 40 years. So here's a scatter plot. Each dot there is one country. This is the very long run change, so I didn't annualize it yet in these slides. Later they are annual. So the x-axis is the money growth and the y-axis is the price change. And obviously it's a very, very strong relationship. It's going to be a lot stronger than the relationship between, say, education and wages. And yet I'm pretty sure that everyone here believes that going to college tends to make your income prospects higher. So but you can see it's a pretty tight relationship as things go in the real world, much stronger than anything we tend to see. Notice it's not a perfect relationship. You can see those two dots there, those two big outliers. When you talk about any kind of real world statistical relationship, immediately a few people would jump on board, whether it's complaining on Twitter or complaining in a book review, and say, hey, look, there are a couple of exceptions there. That disproves your rule. If your relationship isn't almost perfectly strong, then I'm just going to say that it's just false, and you have hubris and a pretense of knowledge, and the real world is too complicated to be mathematized. Well, I don't know. You could spend your lifetime obsessing over exceptions, but really only a fool would ignore the rule. And I'm here to focus on that rule. I think that's where most scientific progress is made, is by focusing on the rule most of the time. So with that, and remember, the quantity theory itself predicts some exceptions. And of course, government statistics are flawed and unreliable and have their own noise. So we don't want to worry too much about exceptions when we still don't even have any rules nailed down. So now having just looked at those scatter plots, that's just like saying, so far all those graphs say is more money, higher prices. Now we got to turn to the most absurd, most mathematical, most reductionistic prediction of the model, of this mathematical economic model, that there's a one-for-one relationship between money growth and inflation. So this isn't a prediction about correlation coefficients. This isn't a claim about R squareds or R's. This is a claim about slopes, about the change in X, change in Y. This is really high school algebra. For some of us, elementary school algebra. Y equals mx plus b. M is supposed to be 1. So in real life, when you just draw an OLS line, ordinary least squares regression line right through the middle of the data, it's not exactly 1, but it's pretty darn close. 0.95. So economic theory makes an exact prediction, and it's a prediction that in real life is 95% true. You could spend your life again worrying about why it's 0.95 and not 1.0. But I've got other things to do with my life, and I hope you do too. We should just take this as a success for the quantity theory and move on. So notice, microeconomists often have to make claims that, well, if demand rises, prices will go up some. I don't know how much. It's the macroeconomists who have the precise quantitative theory that a 1% rise in money will cause a 1% rise in prices. And that relationship is at least 95% true in real life. So microeconomists are the ones who turn out to be vague in real life. It's macroeconomists who often get to make precise quantitative claims and who often find out that those precise quantitative claims are 95% right. Not bad for an obviously false, obviously hubristic theory. So I could just like quit here, declare success, and move on and say, you know, please spend your lives studying mathematical economics. Because it is clearly a proof of concept, like I say. It really nails down the raw possibility that a mathematical model that simplifies the individual choices of millions and millions of people and sums it up with one ridiculously simple equation could possibly be correct. So it works. And it's a proof of the validity and usefulness of some kinds of mathematical economics. It's been around for over a century. So, but it's not just but this isn't just a one-off. This is something that applies in a lot of other cases. So this illustrates the way math models are used in other parts of macroeconomics. So here's a sort of simplified story of the way mathematical models are used in macro. They're often simplified toy models of real-world economies. The quantity theory is a famously simplified total toy model of how the real world works. It's reductionistic. It simplifies things. It leaves things out just the way a map does, or the way Newtonian physics leaves things out. Newtonian physics is wrong compared to Einsteinian physics, but it was good enough to get people on the moon. And that should be plenty good for most of us, even if it doesn't apply at subatomic and very high speeds, at subatomic scales and very high speeds. So for me, at least, having tried doing verbal economics for a long time before I wound up doing mathematical economics, I find that mathematical models are an excellent way to keep track of all the moving pieces. Our brains, at least my brain, is not smart enough to keep track of all these moving pieces in anything like a complicated model. Just keeping track of the Solow model, the ideas in the Solow model, which is diminishing returns to capital and a fixed savings rate and a long time. Just keeping track of those three things is very hard for me. And having a model to keep track of that for me really simplifies things. It helps me find insights I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. I also think that mathematical models, they're an excellent way to keep track of omitted variables. If you're writing something down, you notice what you're missing. When people talk verbally about an economy, they often seem to leave a lot of stuff out. I think people have also seen that mathematical methods are a great way to help you focus on risk, uncertainty, the fact that our models are incomplete measures of reality. A model that's written down is much more clearly imperfect than a verbal discussion. Because verbal discussions might feel sweeping. They might deceive an audience into thinking that they're far more comprehensive than they actually are. So this is something I hope everyone remembers. Everyone's using a model. Some models are verbal, some models are emotional, some models are mathematical. And you should use the right tool for the job. So sometimes a mathematical approach has a lot to offer. So suppose if the critics are right, and economic truths can't be quantified. If the spontaneous order, if the catalactic regime that people create through their choices can't be quantified, can't be reduced to simple equations, then why on earth are so many economic outcomes so quantifiable? So people might say, well, in theory, I have this theory that says that people are too complicated to predict. I have a theory that says that collections of people will create orders that are spontaneous and ever changing and evolving, and there will be creative destruction at both the institutional and firm level. So you can never really predict what's going to happen. if you can't ever predict what's going to happen, why is there so much predictability? Why is it that decade after decade, across the vast majority of countries, wages are about 2/3 of income? Which constantly evolving spontaneous order would keep landing at that number? What's up with that? Why is the ratio of capital to output, K over Y, comes up in the Solow model and other growth models? The total nation stock of capital, the value of its useful physical capital, divided by its GDP, usually about 3. Why does it keep coming back to this number? Sometimes a little higher than that, sometimes a little lower than that, but around 3. It's not 5, it's not 2. Why 3? What kind of human process, what kind of social order, what kind of collective choice or individual choices aggregated over the decades yields that result? Why is the excess return on stocks over short-run bonds around 7%, the real return on stocks over bonds? Why is it 7 and not 0.7 or 70? Why this number? And why for about a century was the long-run growth rate of GDP per person per year about 2%? Why not 0.2 or 20? There's been a lot of persistence, a lot of patterns that have existed in the data, and any theorist should be drawn to patterns like this. So we're not just saying this, we're not just acting like demand, like micro theorists saying, if supply increases, prices will go down a little and output will go up some. We've got precise, our empirics point us toward precise results, and those precise results should tempt a theorist to try to explain why it's one number and not another. So you could just be like a lot of human beings over the millennia who said, yeah, if you drop an apple, it falls. I don't know, maybe it falls faster sometimes than others. I don't know. Things are complicated. Instead, it turns out stuff actually, near Earth accelerates at 9.8 meters per second per second. Why that? I don't know. I'm not a physicist. But as an economist, I'm going to be puzzled by facts like this. The fact that when recessions happen, the drop in labor hours is about 1/3 hours per people and 2/3 people. So you can think of it as 1/3 less overtime, 2/3 less bodies. Why is that pattern the pattern that happens? What is it about the nature of the firm, the nature of people's choices, the nature of work preferences that pushes us in that direction? Again, the fall in labor hours during recessions has been a huge puzzle. And Nobel laureate Ed Prescott he sums it up by saying that it looks a lot like we've got an elasticity of labor supply for a whole economy that's about 3. Why this number, not another? Stock market changes, as many of you know, are nearly unpredictable on a daily basis, yielding a nearly random walk or a unit root, time series terms. What kind of individual choices would lead to that outcome? And what would lead to some interesting exceptions to those rules that have popped up in a lot of varieties of research, especially over the long run? So here's one of my favorite patterns of behavior. 2%. 2% is the rate at which income has tended to converge between rich and poor places for about a century. Certainly from, say, 1880 to 1990, it seemed to hold true across US states. That's an astonishingly reliable relationship. Places that started richer grew slower. Places that started poorer grew faster. And the rate isn't just some random number, it's this strange number of 2%. 2% of the gap just kept closing. What kind of collection of human choices, what kind of collection of human traits or government institutions would yield such a strange number? So this should be at least puzzling to anyone who says people can't be summarized by equations, people can't be quantified, societies as a whole can't be quantified. That's darn quantifiable right there. So it's held for about a century. It's held across US states, true across Japanese prefectures, true across Western Europe. Slowed down a bit in the last couple of decades, perhaps because countries just got closer to where they're supposed to be. And again, we should be asking ourselves, why 2? Why not 0.2? Why not 20? And why so persistent even across decades? This is, again, quantitative patterns cry out for quantitative explanations. They might be too complicated for us. They might be, our answers might be incomplete or imperfect, but trying to answer them can yield a lot. I tend to think one of the great insights that came out of this particular question, the puzzle of why 2%, is that it got economists to stop thinking just in terms of physical capital and also got people to talk in terms of organizational capital. The blogger Arnold Kling has picked up that point a lot, which I've made and drew from other people to get to. So occasionally you'll see the blogger Arnold Kling talking about Garett Jones workers, who are workers who create organizational capital, who help an institution run well, rather than actually flipping the burgers. You're the manager who makes sure that the burgers show up on time. So trying to solve these quantitative puzzles helps push us in interesting directions that might yield new theoretical insights into how people work and produce. Here's another excellent quantitative fact that's just at the edge of macro. Zipf's law. Some of you may know about it. The Zipf's law is the idea that the second biggest city in a country is about 1/2 the population of the biggest city. The 10th biggest city is about 1/10 the population of the biggest, and so on. And this is an example of a power law. And it's astonishing that cities seem to fit this way. It doesn't have to be that way at all, but this seems to be quite common. And similar power laws or size laws seem to hold for the distribution of firm size and a lot of other human behaviors. So Zipf's law, quantitative theory that cries out for an explanation. Again, when economic theorists see a pattern like this, they start looking for what kind of patterns of human interrelationships would generate this. Turns out one way to explain Zipf's law is a story where there's a balance between the amount of positive externalities you get from having a lot of people together and the amount of negative externalities you have from having a lot of people together. So the public goods versus the pollution effect, you might say. And but one wouldn't have started theorizing in that direction if you hadn't seen this precise relationship, a quantitative relationship which cries out for quantitative theory, and a macroeconomic relationship by my standards at least. So there's a lot of resistance to quantitative theory. A lot of you have probably seen that over the years. A lot of people like verbal theory instead, and I think there's at least two big factors that drive this. One is a desire for enthusiasm, and the second is a desire for certainty. When people get passionate about a set of ideas, having to slow down and do the math kind of steals away that passion, steals away the intensity of the feeling for a lot of folks. So, there's another, so that's a sort of, in a sense, a hot reason for rejecting quantitative thinking. There's also a cool reason, even a cold reason for rejecting quantitative economic thinking. That's the desire for certainty. A lot of people just like clear, logical, quantitative answers. But formal mathematical models are a great way of reminding us that a lot of cause and effect in the real world is probabilistic. It's about chances, not certainties. It's about wearing a seatbelt. Wearing a seatbelt makes you safer, but wearing a seatbelt does not guarantee that driving will be safe. So thinking in terms of probabilistic cause and effect is something that it's a barrier for both people who want to engage in very intense emotional thinking, where if we implement my policy, we will get my outcome. And on the other hand, people who desire certainty, who want to believe in axiomatic logical thinking. So one nice thinker for mediating these views, I'd say, is Aristotle, actually. Aristotle was well aware that if you wanted to look at the real world, and especially at the real world patterns of human relationships, you had to jump down from the world of pure logical certainty to probabilistic claims, to enthymemes, to move from syllogisms to enthymemes, from things that are logically necessary to things that just tend to be true. And a lot of causal chains in macroeconomics seem to work that way. So fortunately, mathematical macroeconomics is really a great, offers a lot of great lessons in intellectual humility. And I've been able to learn a lot of those myself. Here's one example of this. I'm I'll use toward the end here as a closing example. Marin Prescott. Prescott has now won a Nobel Prize, partly for his real business cycle theory. So Marin Prescott's famous equity premium puzzle illustrates a lot of these themes of where mathematical economics takes you. It doesn't take you in the direction of certainty always. Sometimes it takes you into the direction of seeing puzzles you couldn't have seen otherwise. So on average, stocks earn a 7% higher return than bonds in the very long run. Some decades up, some decades down, but 7% is the average. And this holds true for the US going back to about the Civil War, and a slightly lower rate of return is what you get when you include, say, the whole world, say Japan, even samples that include Japan and Germany before and after the wars. So Marin Prescott looked at this high rate of return on stocks, and they showed with just a little math, they said reasonably risk-averse people who are at normal levels of risk aversion, who worry about losing their money, would look at these real-world stock returns and look at the risk that is associated with stocks and say, wow, those stocks are really safe considering how high a rate of return you get. I phrased it here. I said an investor might say something like, I don't need a 7% average return premium to justify holding stocks. Just a diverse stock portfolio just feels safe compared to other normal risks. So it looks like the high stock market return compared to bonds, and of course, all economic questions are compared to what? This creates a puzzle. Stocks look like they earn free lunch. Stocks look like they get a too big a rate of return to be justified by the low level of risk to hold them. So by documenting this, by using just a little bit of math to show people, wow, stocks look really safe compared to the risk you're taking. The benefits look really high compared to the costs. Well, to an economist, anytime you see a puzzle like that, you start looking around and wondering why the puzzle's there. Some people would just say, well, who can know? The world's complicated. People are the way they are. Instead, this became an opportunity for detective work. Seeing that high 7% average annual return on stocks created an opportunity for a lot of academic detective work and thousands of papers. A lot of people have tried to solve the equity premium puzzle, and there have been a lot of great things that people have learned since then, even if we don't have an answer. I put it in scare quotes for a reason. So one set of answers says that maybe people are weird about their risk aversion, but only for stocks. I was taught long ago that if you were that risk averse in the rest of your life, you'd never step in a bathtub. So there's a certain kind of risk, the level of risk aversion you'd have to say, oh, stocks, man, I'd only hold those if there were a 7% higher rate of return. You would never set foot outdoors. You would never walk outdoors on a rainy day for fear of being hit by lightning. So that's weird. And so that gave behavioral economists an angle to start studying this. Why would people be especially obsessed with this one certain kind of risk compared to other kinds of risks? Or is there a pattern that shows up that we just hadn't noticed? Alternately, maybe it's just a mistake. So maybe people have been mistaken for a long time and they kind of thought stocks were risky, but then once the word gets out that they're actually a lot safer than they thought, people will push up the price a lot and so push down the future returns. Maybe there will be one big final rally where stock prices go up, 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 up. And then after that, they start earning low rates forever. They start being earning only a little bit higher rate of return than government bonds, maybe corporate bonds. So this was a theme actually of a widely mocked, but also truly theoretically driven investment book called Dow 36,000. People mocked it because, it seemed like, wow, stocks aren't going to just rally and stocks really are risky. But the book itself was driven by this puzzle. And their solution to the puzzle was someday people will wise up and start acting a lot more like Homo economicus. They'll start realizing stocks aren't as risky as you thought. Again, driven by theory. Then there's a bunch of theories that say maybe it has something to do with taxes on investments. Scott did a little of that story for a while. There are thousands of papers on this, so there are thousands of speculations, but they're all in the maybe category, right? But notice, this is a set of puzzles you wouldn't have thought about if you hadn't used quantitative theory in advance. So normal people out there in the real world are worried about stock volatility. Mathematical economists worry about why stocks are so darn safe. Why do they seem to be handing out a free lunch? And that creates a puzzle, and a puzzle creates detective work, and a detective work creates additional economic insights. So this is an insight like many that I could talk about that you wouldn't have gotten to without math, without a formal mathematical model. So I want to give us some suggested reading here. If you're looking for something on this, Robert Lucas, Nobel laureate, wrote a short little essay called "What Economists Do." It was like something like a convocation speech at the University of Chicago a long time ago. And it's a reminder that all of us are thinking in terms of metaphors. Lucas wrote his Nobel Prize winning papers with a ton of math, but the math isn't that hard, and B, underneath it are some metaphors. And he does a pretty good job summing up his Nobel winning ideas in this little paper. How does he do it? He tells a story. He says, we economists are basically storytellers. And so he wants to tell a story about where depressions come from, and he illustrates it by talking about an amusement park. He uses a set of metaphors. So all of us are using metaphors to think about the economy. And some of those metaphors fall better than others. And so I hope that those of you out there who've thought about this question of what kind of metaphor should you use to think about about spontaneous orders we create, will realize that and conclude that sometimes these mathematical models are the best way forward for thinking about the complex societies we live in. So I'll stop there, and maybe folks will have some questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. I know I have a couple of questions. You talked about how the more verbal approach to economics is a lot more appealing to students, maybe getting them sucked in. I know I'm definitely one of those students, but I wanted to ask you, do you think that has value, maybe particularly in introductory courses? Do you think there is a good balance where maybe a lot of that verbal theory is useful for getting students attracted, or even verbal theory that has a lot of solid ground to it, maybe?
Absolutely. I think we should always try to use like verbal metaphors to sort of introduce people to things. And sometimes that's the right place to end it, right? So for instance, the Kennywood Park essay here, where Lucas tries to explain how price confusion at the individual level could lead to recessions at the national level, he tells it very well in 2 pages with just words by saying, what if they issued 2 different kinds of coupons at 2 different kinds of tickets at the park? And so his metaphor about price confusion is something you can tell verbally. Real business cycle theory is just the idea that you make hay while the sun shines. You work harder when the weather's good, and you work less hard when the weather's bad. And that's a story that you can tell with just Robinson Crusoe. Again, it's a story you can make fun of, because how can a national economy be as simple as Robinson Crusoe? But I just showed you that you can explain all of inflation with one equation, which is weird. So yeah, you start off with, remembering that the model is a metaphor should open you up to using verbal metaphors to tell the story.
Gotcha. Another question here. I think maybe one of the major criticisms of mainstream macro mathematical models is people might, on the free market side, might associate it with like public policy design. Do you think if a model is if a model is used to like maybe influence certain public policies, like that when the policy is implemented, then a lot of things happen that doesn't take into account, and maybe that turns people off from the model?
Well, you got to compare it to the alternative, right? I've read the Communist Manifesto a bunch of times, and there's not an equation in there. That got a lot of people killed. Right?
Right.
I've never read Mein Kampf, but that apparently doesn't have any equations in it either, right? So when we look at terrible economic and social orders that have been created, people manage to do a great job creating those without an equation in sight. So I think one should actually have to make the case that an equation could do worse than just verbal stuff, because verbal stuff seems to have gotten a lot of bad things done too. And again, the quantity theory, which is what people use to argue for low inflation, is a very mathematical model, right? The kind of people who claim to be skeptical of mathematical methods tend to be the kind of people who want zero inflation. And 0 is a very precise number. right? That's a mathematical model right there. So it seems as though it's mathematical models for me, but not for thee.
Right.
You know, people who say they're verbalists actually have some math, but they only like certain math. They want to tabooify. They want to ban other kinds of math on other issues. Just math for the thing they want, which is zero inflation or negative inflation, whatever it is.
Yeah, it's interesting you make that point because it reminds me of, I know studying like the Austrian like critique of socialism, I think Brian Kaplan pointed out, he was like, well, they don't like mathematical modeling or any of that, but when they talk about how, oh, socialist calculation becomes impossible, like with a large economy, with a large number of actors, he was like, wait a minute, okay, well, how big is that? How big is a large number of actors? Doesn't that imply that a certain number of people acting and trading that makes it impossible? Doesn't that imply some sort of quantitative exactness?
That's a quantitative model right there, right? So yeah, there's a lot of people have quantitative models they just don't want to talk about.
That's fair enough, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if there's any more questions in the future, we'll relay them to you, but thank you so much for coming on.